Captain's personal log, January 5th, 2153. After a successful first contact with the Sontarans, we've arranged a reception for them on board Enterprise. The Sontarans are also eager to host some of the crew, and so Commander Tucker, Ensign Sato, and Lieutenant Reed have accepted their invitation on Enterprise's behalf. I've asked Ensign Mayweather to take them down in a shuttle pod and to return with the group of Sontaran delegates. I'm told the reception on the Sontaran homeworld will be a less formal affair. I kind of wish I was going with them. Pause. Computer, delete that last sentence. Archer felt stiff and uncomfortable in his dress uniform as he accompanied Trip and the others to the launch bay. Travis will come get you at 2300 hours. Any problems? Give us a call. I'll send regular reports on the hour, sir, Malcolm said, looking serious. I think just once during the evening will be enough, Archer said, smiling. It's meant to be a party after all. Malcolm pursed his lips. Aye, sir. Sure we can't persuade you to come, Captain? Trip said with a grin as they stepped into the launch bay. Let T'Pol and Phlox hold the fort? It's tempting. Hoshi interjected. I've briefed the sub-commander on the use of the translator, as well as the necessary rituals. Remember, Captain, you're not to address the Sontarans directly. You're practically royalty to them. He caught Trip smirking. I remember. And Dr. Phlox will help you with the headdress. He should be nearly finished with the tassels. Trip's eyes lit up. There's a headdress? At that moment, Travis stuck his head out from the shuttle. Travis, Archer said loudly, greeting his helmsman in an effort to deflect Trip's attention. All set? Yes, sir, Travis replied. We've just received confirmation on 6 delegates waiting for us planetside. He nodded and held out his hands. Well, have a good time, and watch yourselves. We'll see you in a few hours. Wait, Trip persisted. What's this about a headdress? Behind him, Malcolm shook his head and Hoshi hid a smile. Bye, Trip. Take a picture, Trip called after him. On the shuttle, Trip was still chuckling to himself. He was glad the away team didn't have to wear formal uniforms or ritualistic headdresses for that matter. The Sontarans had requested they come in casual clothes, curious to see what passed for human fashion. So in that spirit, he'd donned his beloved Hawaiian shirt. Malcolm clearly hadn't gotten the memo. He was wearing cargo pants and his Starfleet jacket over a t-shirt. At least Hoshi, in a floral summer dress, looked like she was actually going to a party. What should we expect down there, Ensign? Malcolm said solemnly. It's a party, Malcolm, he said with a touch of exasperation. We're not going into battle. I'm aware of that, Commander, Malcolm said tightly, and Trip had to fight the urge to roll his eyes. But that's no excuse not to be careful. Forewarned is forearmed. I was going to brief you both anyway, Hoshi interrupted quickly, before Trip could retort. The party's outside. The climate's pretty mild, even though it'll be evening there. I'll be using the translator, so you'll have to go through me if you want to talk to them. According to Dr. Phlox, their eyesight is limited, so they might rely more on touch to communicate. Malcolm looked mildly horrified at the prospect. Hoshi continued, There'll be a lot of food and drink served. My advice is to try a small bite of everything, and do it slowly. Slow and steady, got it, Trip said. Same with any alcohol. Take a few sips to be polite, then switch to water. Malcolm frowned, no doubt unhappy about having to drink on duty. They'll probably want you to perform something from Earth, a song or a poem, so have something prepared. Trip nudged Malcolm with his foot. You've got a good memory. Bet you know some poetry. Hoshi looked at Malcolm expectantly, and under the weight of their combined gaze, Malcolm reluctantly obliged, clearing his throat. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. What the hell's that? Trip exclaimed. It's the charge of the Light Brigade, Malcolm said, looking affronted. By Tennyson, or would you rather, there once was a man from Nantucket? Something a little more cheery, maybe. Commander Tucker's right, Hoshi said apologetically. It's best to stay away from anything that could be considered a cultural taboo, like war or death. Fine, Malcolm said tersely. There was an awkward pause. As I was saying, Hoshi continued, they've planned some dancing. Malcolm winced. Activities and traditional games. What, like spin the bottle? Trip said with a wink. It's not a frat party, Commander, Malcolm shot back. I was kidding, he said, genuinely irked now. Would you lighten up? Hoshi, Travis interrupted in a low voice. The Sontarans are contacting us. As Hoshi moved up to the cockpit, Trip glanced at his friend in irritation. He'd been really looking forward to hanging out with Malcolm, but his attitude was putting a real dampener on things. Why'd you even volunteer for this anyway if you didn't want to come? Instead of rising to the bait, Malcolm closed his eyes and leant his head back against the bulkhead wearily. Someone from security needed to come. To a party! Malcolm opened his eyes to glare at him. To an alien culture that we know nothing about. There's no record of the Sontarans in the Vulcan database, and Dr. Phlox claims not to have heard of them either. That's why we're having this party, to get to know them. A flare of annoyance. And when has that ever gone well? The idea of parties and receptions might seem terribly fun, but if we inadvertently set a foot wrong, then we have no idea what the consequences might be. Remember the Krita Sans? The Fulbrani? And that's even if the Sontarines aren't harboring any malintent towards us. Trip shook his head at his friend's cynicism. Nothing will happen. Something always happens, Malcolm countered heatedly. Trip bit back a retort. To be fair, Enterprise hadn't had the best track record of late. Well, if something does happen, we'll deal with it. Together. Malcolm just huffed, looking skeptical, before leaning back again, pinching the bridge of his nose. Even though Trip was still feeling a little put out, he couldn't help but ask, You okay? Malcolm's gaze flicked to his. In a subdued voice, he said, I've got a bit of a headache. Phlox gave me something before we left, but it hasn't kicked in yet. Trip winced. That's too bad. He settled back in his seat, slightly more mollified now. Up front, Hoshi was still talking to the Sontarans, conversing in low tones. Then Malcolm surprised him by saying, My mother always said we'd be the death of her. At Trip's questioning look, he added, Maddie and I, we used to drive her to distraction. She'd always be worrying about us, what we'd be getting up to. She couldn't switch off. Trip watched him. That how you feel? Malcolm looked away. I'm responsible for the security of Enterprise. That's not something you can simply take a break from. It was rare for Malcolm to speak so openly. Indeed, his posture was tense, as if he was expecting to be ridiculed. But Trip just felt sorry for him. Here they were, a bunch of explorers, about to set foot on an alien world, off to a party no less. Malcolm deserved to enjoy it. They all did. I'll let you in on a little secret, Trip said. The key to taking a break is trusting that someone else has got your back. He swatted Malcolm's arm, playfully. Like me. Malcolm looked down at his arm, but didn't say anything. For what it's worth, Trip added. I think these Sontarans are the good guys. Malcolm raised his head and stared at him incredulously. And just what do you base that on? Trip sat a little straighter. My instincts. To his chagrin, Malcolm seemed to find that idea hilarious. Your instincts, he scoffed. What's so funny? Trip said indignantly. Malcolm shook his head. Don't take this the wrong way, Commander, but you've got the worst self-preservation instincts of anyone I've ever met. That's not true. But Malcolm kept laughing softly to himself. Your instincts. And so Trip just glared at him and looked out the porthole instead. Travis brought the shuttle down in what seemed like a huge botanical garden that stretched for miles. As they climbed out the shuttle, Trip was met with a wave of warmth and the smell of spices and other scents he couldn't identify. It was dusk, and the suns were setting. A group of Sontaran delegates were there to welcome them. He and Malcolm hung back slightly with Travis, leaving it to Hoshi to make the appropriate introductions. Malcolm was assessing the situation surreptitiously, although he seemed more relaxed than he had on the shuttle. Either Phlox's painkillers had kicked in, or laughing at Trip had cheered him up a bit. Trip looked casually around too, trying to see it the way Malcolm would. There was a throng of Sontarans, who were humanoid, mostly, and who wore hardly any clothing and were covered in strange markings. They seemed excited, like large, heavy-set, hairy children. Beyond, through the trees, there were flickering lights, no doubt where the party was being held. They're ready, Hoshi said, in a low voice, and taking his cue, Travis smiled politely at the Enterprise-bound Sontarans. This way, he said, gesturing, and the Sontarans clambered into the shuttle, grunting curiously amongst themselves. See you in a few hours, Tripp said, and Travis nodded. The rest of them stepped back as the shuttle lifted off. There were murmurs of appreciation from the remaining Sontarans, even though they too had their own shuttle fleet and warp capabilities. They want us to follow them, Hoshi said to Tripp and Malcolm. The Sontarans held out their hands expectantly. Hold their hands, she hissed as she brushed past to the front of the group to converse with the ambassador. Tripp took the hand of the nearest Sontaran, feeling slightly silly. Malcolm was still standing a ways off and on impulse. Tripp grabbed his hand and pulled him close. Malcolm looked disapproving and pleased at the same time. The Sontarans led them down a path lined with exotic trees. Everything seemed like an explosion of color after the gray, drab tones of Enterprise, and the air hummed and pulsed with the chitter of insects. The Sontaran's hand holding Tripp's was limp and cold, and in contrast, Malcolm's grip was warm and strong. They emerged through the trees to a huge bonfire with a stage next to it, and he felt Malcolm's hand tighten reflexively at the crowd of people. One of the Sontarans ascended the stage to perform the welcome speeches, and from Hoshi's subtle motions it was evident they were expected to keep holding hands still. The sun set, and darkness fell. Tripp listened attentively to the speeches to begin with, but there were many, twice as long, with Hoshi running everything through the universal translator, and after a while, his attention wandered. He started to squeeze Malcolm's hand, almost imperceptibly at first, then harder and harder. Malcolm looked at him sharply, and Tripp kept a straight face. Malcolm proceeded to endure the pressure until he could do so no longer, and then he pulled away a fraction. Tripp relaxed his grip. A few minutes later, he felt Malcolm doing the same, a slight pressure that increased and increased until it was bone-crushing, until Tripp could take it no more and he flinched and Malcolm let up. They did it a couple more times until Hoshi shot them a look, as if she somehow knew they were up to something. And then suddenly the party was in full swing, kicking off with fireworks and music. He let go of Malcolm's hand and flexed his own as Malcolm smiled ruefully. Some Sontarans approached them and pressed syrupy drinks into their hands and smiled at them expectantly. Tripp raised his glass and took a sip, and nearly spat it out. It was like drinking stale plasma coolant. Not bad, he choked, as Malcolm coughed violently next to him. The Sontarans patted them on their heads, trying to console them, looking distressed. They said you don't have to drink it all, Hoshi told them quickly. It's just ceremonial. Thank goodness for that, Malcolm said in a rusty voice, still coughing. That stuff could power the warp drive. One of the Sontarans took Malcolm by the arm. He'll get you some water, Hoshi explained, as Malcolm was led away. In contrast, Tripp found himself being steered towards the direction of the barbecues. The Sontarans loaded up his plate and then guided him to sit amongst the rugs and cushions that had been thoughtfully placed next to the bonfire. He was surrounded by other Sontarans who were chatting amongst themselves, reclining, relaxed, and who periodically urged him to keep eating. The food actually wasn't too bad, though he was starting to feel a little bored without anyone to talk to. He couldn't see Hoshi or Malcolm anywhere, and the more time went on, the more he started to get a prickling of worry. Then, just as he was about to go looking for them, Malcolm suddenly appeared out of nowhere, plonking himself down on the mat next to Tripp and breathing heavily. "Where have you been?" Tripp said with more heat than he'd intended. But Malcolm wasn't listening. Instead, he was eyeing up Tripp's plate. "Do you mind? I'm starving." Without waiting for an answer, he used his fingers to scoop up a fluffy-looking morsel that looked like mashed potato and popped it in his mouth. That's delicious," he mumbled. "Tastes like—" He made a gesture, trying to recall the word, and swallowed. "What are those things Chef made for Thanksgiving, with the marshmallows?" Tripp blinked. "Yams?" "Yes," Malcolm beamed at him. "Yams. I love yams." He helped himself to another handful. Tripp was a little taken aback by his friend's enthusiasm. "Are you okay?" Malcolm nodded brightly. "Never better." Then he swallowed again. "Hoshi's over there with the ambassador," he pointed. "She's checked in with Enterprise already." Tripp relaxed slightly, but only slightly, because there was clearly something going on with Malcolm. Somewhere along the way, he'd managed to lose his jacket, and his t-shirt clung to him, drenched in sweat. His hair was equally disheveled, and he had a manic look about him that Tripp had only seen when he was in the process of blowing something up. "Are you sure you're okay?" Tripp said again. "You're acting kind of—" "I'm fine, Commander," Malcolm said, licking the mashed potato from his fingers. "You're sweating buckets," I was dancing. Malcolm caught sight of Tripp's glass of water. Do you mind? And he downed the glass in one, rivets of water running down his neck. Wait, you were dancing? Malcolm nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The lighter gravity here really helps. That reminds me. He took the plate from Tripp's hands and started tugging him up. What are you? We're supposed to be dancing. Malcolm succeeded in pulling Tripp to his feet and ushered him towards the revelers, despite Tripp's protests. The Saunterins cheered upon their arrival, delighted to see Malcolm again. They were moving about like tree branches in a tornado, doing strange flailing motions with their arms to the sound of the drums, and Tripp half expected Malcolm to start copying them. But instead, Malcolm leapt high into the air, executing a flying kick, landing low like a cat, and then in the next instant flipping himself over. The Saunterins were going wild, cheering and flailing, and all Tripp could do was stand there gaping as his usually reserved friend spun and whirled himself about in some kind of bizarre street dance martial arts frenzy. It shouldn't have come as a surprise, really. He'd seen Malcolm performing combat drills often enough, prowling and springing about with an effortless fluidity that always made Tripp feel clumsy by comparison. But this was different. Malcolm kept his gaze on Tripp the entire time, as if he was daring him, challenging him. Are you drunk? Tripp shouted over the music, and Malcolm just laughed and flashed him a brilliant smile. No. Then what are you? Malcolm moved close and shouted in his ear, Happy! Then he did another one of those impossible flips, landing on his hands, before launching into a one-man sparring show against an invisible opponent. The Saunterins cheered even louder, stamping their hooves in appreciation, and Tripp just stood there with his mouth hanging open. Hoshi appeared beside him. Is he okay? She shouted over the music. I don't think so, he shouted back. Is he drunk? He said he isn't. They watched Malcolm dancing. I don't know. Maybe he's eaten something, or could be the meds. He had a headache before. Maybe he's having some kind of a reaction. Maybe. At that moment, Malcolm sprang and lunged for Tripp, and with surprising strength, nearly pulled him off his feet. Come and dance with me, he shouted over the music. In a minute, Tripp shouted back, pulling his arm free. The ambassador came over and said something to Hoshi. He wants to know if everything's okay, Hoshi relayed to Tripp. Tell him our friend's sick. Very sick. All three of them looked at Malcolm, now involved in some kind of breakdancing routine with two other Saunterins. The ambassador said something else. He said he doesn't look sick, Hoshi translated. I think we should contact Enterprise, Tripp said, ignoring the ambassador. We're rendezvousing with the shuttle in less than 2 hours, Hoshi pointed out reasonably. Tripp frowned. He might be okay for now, but what if he crashes? Or has a reaction? I mean, more of one. I'm not going to risk it. Hoshi looked beyond him at Malcolm, concerned now. Keep an eye on him, he said, and he moved away from the throng to contact Enterprise. A few Saunterins followed him with plates of food and he waved them off. He found a spot near the trees and took out his communicator. Tucker to Enterprise. Static. Tucker to Enterprise, come in. More static. I can't get through, Tripp said, coming back to Hoshi and the ambassador. Too much interference. The ambassador said something to Tripp, looking worried. What did he say? He said it's probably because of the ion storm, Hoshi said. Tripp frowned. What ion storm? The ambassador pointed upwards at the ink-black sky with its smattering of stars. He says, can't we sense it? Sense what? The ion storm. Hoshi! His head was beginning to pound now in time with the drums. Suddenly Malcolm was right in front of him again, flushed and sweating, his eyes wild and dark. Are you coming to dance now? But Malcolm was tugging him into the crowd, and he pulled back. Hold up a sec. Hoshi says there's an ion storm. We can't contact Enterprise. There's always a bloody ion storm, Malcolm hollered over the music. Come and dance. Just hold on. Hoshi had her tricorder out and was taking readings. Tripp held on to Malcolm's hand firmly. It was the only way he could anchor his friend. Malcolm stood there impatiently, jittering with energy. Tricorder confirms atmospheric disturbances in the upper atmosphere, Hoshi said. Can I see? Tripp said, and he took the tricorder with his free hand and scrolled through the display. The ambassador spoke again. He said it's the season for ion storms, Hoshi translated. They form very quickly, last a few hours, and interfere with all the electrical equipment. They aren't safe to fly in. Why didn't T'Pol's sensors detect it? Something about the way the electricity interacts with the particles in the atmosphere? Hoshi repeated a phrase in Sontaran and shook her head. I'm not sure what he's saying. Great, Tripp said, handing the tricorder back. So we're stuck here. The ambassador was looking deeply concerned now, and he spoke to Hoshi in a torrent of words, whilst looking at Tripp earnestly. Hoshi attempted to translate simultaneously. He thinks we don't want to be here. He's worried because you think we're trapped here. He says we should be grateful for the storm because it prolongs our stay, and we can avail ourselves of their hospitality for a while longer. The storm will dissipate soon enough. The Centarans on Enterprise would say the same. In an undertone, Hoshi added, I think you really upset him. Smile and reassure him. Tripp plastered on a wide smile. Thank you. Thank you for having us here. We're glad to be here. We're just concerned about our friend, that's all. He's not himself. The ambassador held out his hands and Hoshi translated. He says that your friend is enjoying himself. Please do, likewise, until the storm passes. You heard the man, Malcolm said cheerfully. You better do what he says, Hoshi told them. I'll stay and do some damage control. With a sinking feeling, Tripp allowed Malcolm to lead him to the center of the dance pit. Malcolm started up his wildcat routine again, and Tripp stood there, attempting to dance, feeling awkward and more than a little rusty. It had been a while since he'd been out like this. The 602 Club was a distant memory, and it wasn't as if he and Malcolm had done a whole lot of dancing on Ryza. What's wrong? Malcolm said in his face. Nothing's wrong. I'm just out of practice. Malcolm nodded sympathetically, as if it was a problem he had to deal with all the time. Try this. Imagine you're sparring with me, but don't let the punches land. What? It's a form of dancing in some cultures. Come on, try and land one on me. Malcolm stood there expectantly. Okay. Hesitantly, Tripp threw a punch and Malcolm darted back. Then Malcolm leapt forward, fist raised, and pulled back at the last second. Tripp flinched anyway, and Malcolm grinned. Goaded, Tripp threw another punch. Malcolm ducked, then came back at him with a dropkick, attempting to sweep Tripp's legs from under him. Tripp jumped away, and then went for Malcolm again. They started to find their rhythm, and Tripp was surprised to realize that he was actually having fun. There was no time to think, just to act and react. Malcolm weaved and darted like he was made of air, laughing as he did so. And then a firework exploded next to them and Tripp froze, momentarily stunned, and in that pause, there was a sudden impact to his temple, and he went down heavily in the dust. The pain came a split second later, like thunder after lightning. Malcolm was on his knees in front of him, his lips moving, but everything was ringing. Some Sontarans helped carry him back to the rugs and fussed around him. Malcolm was practically sitting in his lap, had stripped off his t-shirt, and was holding it to Tripp's head to stem the bleeding. I'm so sorry, he kept saying, looking stricken. I thought you were going to duck. It's fine, Tripp said, leaning away. Shouldn't have frozen up like that. No, it's my fault. It's no one's fault. The Sontarans were huddled round still, grunting to one another, amazed by the blood, and Malcolm, too close, half naked, dabbing at the cut ineffectually with his shirt. I'm all right, Tripp said, and he tried to push Malcolm away. Maybe get me some ice? Malcolm nodded, still looking anxious, and headed off towards the drinks tables. Tripp sighed and held Malcolm's sweat-soaked t-shirt to his head, trying not to think about how gross that was, and smiling through clenched teeth at the Sontarans to show he was okay. What happened? Hoshi demanded, coming up with the ambassador in tow. We just got a little overexcited, that's all, Tripp said, deliberately underplaying it. The ambassador touched the blood on Tripp's head and then said something to Hoshi. He says, do you need medical attention? No, it's fine, I think it's stopping. He took Malcolm's shirt away, and there was a fresh surge of blood. He hastily held it back on, keeping up the pressure. Think you can find me a clean cloth? Hold on, let me ask. And a moment later, a new cloth was pressed into his hands. As Tripp switched the cloths over, Hoshi said, The ambassador says they're going to be performing the ceremony of the ritual of speeches soon. Tripp addressed the ambassador loudly. Tell him I'll sit this one out, thanks. Hoshi translated along with the ambassador's response. He said, of course, stay and rest with your friend. She looked round her. Where is the lieutenant? He went to get some ice, and he felt a stab of worry. Should be back by now. He started to get up, and Hoshi put a hand on his shoulder. I'll go look for him. He can't have gone far. As she rose, she said something to one of the Sontarans, and a few moments later, Trip was handed an ice pack. He nodded his thanks and held the pack tenderly to his head, and he waited. In due course, the ceremony of the ritual of speeches started up, and Hoshi was called upon to translate, and Malcolm still wasn't back. And every time Trip tried to go looking for him, a particularly meaty Sontaran tugged him down again, tutting over his injury, even though it had stopped bleeding a while ago. And then, just as Trip was about to make a break for it, Malcolm crashed down ungainly onto the mat next to him. Trip jumped. Where the hell have you been? I couldn't find your ice, Malcolm said. There was a noticeable slur in his voice now. Doesn't matter about the damn ice. And then he faltered. By the light of the bonfire, he could see markings all over Malcolm's upper body, thick black-blue lines crisscrossing over his chest, up his arms, along his neck, and covering his face. What are those? Malcolm looked down at himself. Oh, I think they might be tattoos. On your face? They aren't permanent, but he sounded uncertain as he rubbed at the ink. Actually, I think they might be. I'm not sure. You didn't think to check? Malcolm looked at him, his eyes glittering strangely in the firelight. It's a great honor. They represent the battle lines. It's the most anyone's touched me since we left Space Dock. Trip blinked, unsure how to respond to that. Before he could say anything, an ear-splitting sound started up, not unlike discordant bagpipes, and Malcolm snapped to attention. Whoa! Trip said, startled. Take it easy. Do you hear that? Malcolm said, looking around him. Yeah, I can hear it. Hoshi appeared and Trip jumped again. They're wanting us to sing something from Earth. Trip recoiled. I don't think that's such a good idea. I think it's an excellent idea, Malcolm said, standing up and swaying ever so slightly before launching himself in the direction of the music. Hey, wait a minute, Trip said, scrambling to go with him, shrugging off Hoshi's offer of assistance. You've prepared something, haven't you? Hoshi was saying urgently as they followed Malcolm, and her tone made him feel like he was back in grade school again. I've been a little preoccupied, he said defensively. What about you? I've been giving speeches for the past half hour, she shot back, a touch of indignation in her tone. It's your turn now. But as it turned out, he didn't have to perform anything because Malcolm had already climbed onto the stage and was having words with the Sontaran drummer who started pounding out a beat. The Sontarans in the crowd responded by stamping in time with the music. This isn't going to go well, Trip muttered to himself. Up on stage, Malcolm was scanning the crowd, clearly searching for someone. Then he spotted Trip and gestured frantically for him to join him on the stage. Trip groaned. You'd better go, Hoshi said in his ear. And so reluctantly Trip pushed his way up and went to stand beside his friend. Follow my lead, Malcolm shouted to him over the drumming. How? He started to say, but Malcolm wasn't listening as he launched into song, clapping his hands and stamping his foot as he did so. What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? Ere lie in the morning. The tune was familiar, although it took Trip a second to place it. Meanwhile, Malcolm was watching Trip as he sang, waiting for him to join in, a look of uncertainty on his face, and it was that more than anything that galvanized Trip into action. He started singing along self-consciously. Way hey up, she rises, way hey up, she rises, and he was rewarded by a flash of a relieved smile. Malcolm actually had a pretty decent voice, and it carried powerfully across the crowd. He'd dropped his accent in favor of some kind of pirate slang. The Sontarans were loving it, stamping along in time with the music, joining in the chorus with frightening gusto. And despite everything, Trip was cautiously enjoying himself too, sharing the stage with Malcolm, who kept coming close as if he were singing just to him. With a nod at the drummer, Malcolm led everyone through the final chorus again, and then they screeched to a stop. The Sontarans went wild, grunting and stamping, and Trip was grinning, and Malcolm was beaming at him, exhilarated. The song seemed to give everyone a second wind because the dancing started up again, and Malcolm was dragged down off the stage into the huddle. Trip managed to grab his hand because he was damned if he was going to let Malcolm go off on his own again, and so he was pulled along with him into the center. It was like being in the eye of the storm. As the Sontarans swirled around them, he and Malcolm stood still, catching their breath, holding hands still. Somewhere along the way, it had started to rain, light and cool enough to be refreshing, and Malcolm looked upwards into the night sky. Tripp followed his gaze. There were flashes above them, the ion storm made visible, and they were standing on an alien planet, and it was raining. Malcolm caught his eye and smiled, and Tripp just knew he was thinking the same thing. And then suddenly, Malcolm's gaze went horribly blank, and he let go of Tripp's hand, and too late, Tripp realized he was fainting. Tripp lunged for him, didn't so much catch him as managed to slow his descent to the ground. "I need help!" he shouted, leaning over Malcolm to stop him from being trampled. "I'm all right," Malcolm slurred groggily. "Shut up," Tripp told him, as a couple of the Sontarans crouched next to him, and together they all hauled Malcolm up. The other Sontarans made a lane for them as they headed back to the rugs yet again and propped Malcolm up against a stack of heavy cushions. "You got a doctor?" Tripp asked the Sontarans, who were looking at them bemused. "I'm fine," Malcolm slurred. "Don't fuss." "You don't get to tell me not to fuss," Tripp said, rounding on him and jabbing his finger. Malcolm blinked slowly. "Why are you so angry?" "I'm not angry," he said, scanning the surroundings for Hoshi. "I'm worried." But Malcolm was still looking at him, head tilted, mouth slightly open. "But what are you worried about?" "You," Tripp exploded. "I'm worried about you." A beat, and then a beatific smile spread over Malcolm's face. "Do you know," he slurred, "that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." Tripp rolled his eyes. "I really hope it's not." He snagged the nearest Sontaran. "You know where our colleague is? Our friend? Ensign Sato? The woman?" The Sontaran just smiled at him. "I'm all right, really," Malcolm said, slumping down even further. "I just want to sleep." "I don't think that's such a good idea." "It's a great idea," Malcolm mumbled. "Malcolm!" He knelt beside him and held him up as best he could, and he could feel him trembling. "Are you cold?" "Feeling rather hot, actually." Malcolm's eyes drifted closed, and Tripp gave him a shake. "Stop doing that," Malcolm said irritably. "Stop falling asleep, then." He knew he should just go find Hoshi, but he didn't want to leave Malcolm alone for fear of him throwing up or choking or having a seizure or doing any number of those things people did when they were coming down from something, especially now that the fire was low and it was almost completely dark. He scrubbed a hand over his face, trying to think what to do. Meanwhile, Malcolm shivered and curled in on himself. Perhaps it was because a few of the Sontarans had already decided to call it a night and were nestling together in clusters to sleep. In any case, it didn't seem out of place for Tripp to heave Malcolm up, to sidle in behind him, to snag a blanket and wrap it round Malcolm's shoulders and draw Malcolm to him so that his friend was lying against him, half strewn across his lap. It was a lot harder for Tripp to worry when Malcolm was right there in front of him, where he could feel him breathing, feel his heart beating, feel the reassuring weight of him. By the time Hoshi found them, Malcolm was completely out of it. Even more worryingly, Hoshi didn't look at all surprised at their arrangement. "Is he okay?" "I don't know," Tripp said, biting back his irritation. "I've been trying to find you." "I've been with the ambassador. Enterprise just contacted me. They're on their way. The storm's beginning to dissipate." Relief flooded through him. "It's about time." "Is he unconscious?" Hoshi said, putting her palm to Malcolm's forehead. "No. He wakes up if I do this." And Tripp shook him. Malcolm stirred and muttered something crossly before settling again. "Well, I can ask the Sontarans for a doctor," Hoshi said, resting her hand on top of Malcolm's head thoughtfully. "But I'm not sure it would do much good. Our physiology's pretty different." Phlox manages. "Because he's got over a dozen degrees in xenobiology. The Sontarans just met us yesterday." They both looked down at Malcolm again. Malcolm was still sleeping, the ink on his face now smeared, and Tripp tightened his arms round him reflexively. "Guess we can leave it," he said. "Seems like whatever's in his system is wearing off. Travis shouldn't be too far away, right?" Hoshi nodded. "They'll be here within the hour." They settled down to wait. At one point, Hoshi moved away, and Malcolm shifted and coughed, the blanket falling down. As Tripp rearranged it, one of the Sontarans held out their arms, indicating they could take Malcolm. "I got it, thanks," Tripp said, and he drew Malcolm in protectively. For all the Sontarans' hospitality, Tripp was very aware of how vulnerable they were down here, and the responsibility he had for his crewmates, especially the armory officer currently passed out in his arms. It made it difficult to relax. He felt a strange combination of wired and tired. Was this what it was like for Malcolm all the time? As he sat there, cradling his best friend, watching the stars, one caught his eye. It was moving differently from the rest, becoming brighter, brighter, and he realized it was the shuttle. Archer had decided to fetch the away team himself, along with T'Pol and the Sontaran delegates who had been on Enterprise. Hoshi came forward to greet them. "Hoshi," Archer said, smiling broadly. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner." "That's all right, Captain," she said, addressing the Sontarans as well as Archer. "We're grateful for the extra time the storm gave us here. It's been a remarkable experience." The Sontarans grunted in satisfaction. "Glad to hear it," Archer said, looking round for his other officers. Then he saw Trip pushing through the crowd, followed by Malcolm staggering behind him, draped in a blanket, looking a little worse for wear. Before Archer could say anything, one of the Sontarans spoke up animatedly to Hoshi. "He said to tell you your crew member dances like one possessed," Hoshi translated, and the Sontaran performed an enthusiastic 1-2 uppercut to the cheers of the other Sontarans. Archer smiled, a little bemused. Commander Tucker can always be counted on to join in the fun. But a ripple of confusion went round at the mention of Tucker's name. "I believe they are referring to Lieutenant Reed," T'Pol said discreetly in his ear. Puzzled, he turned towards Malcolm. Malcolm was still hiding behind Trip, but now he stepped forward, a look of resignation on his face. With great dignity, he extricated himself from the blanket, refusing a helping hand from Trip, and gave the blanket to a nearby Sontaran. Meanwhile, Archer stared in surprise at his tactical officer. Malcolm was shirtless, covered in paint, hair sticking up in all directions. If Archer hadn't known better, he'd say Malcolm had been the chief participant at an all-night rave. One of the Sontarans put his hands either side of Malcolm's face and embraced him, chanting, "Way hey," as the other Sontarans laughed and cheered. "They're saying Lieutenant Reed is very entertaining," Hoshi translated, "and they want you to bring him back very soon." Malcolm glanced at the captain sheepishly, his ears a furious red, while Trip groaned. Archer turned to Trip for answers, and instead was struck by the rather impressive cut on Trip's forehead. "What happened to you?" Tucker grimaced. "It's a long story." The same Sontaran who had embraced Malcolm now clapped Trip heartily on the shoulder. "He says you're wound too tight. You need to relax more," Hoshi translated, as Trip struggled to contain his outrage. "You should be more like your friend." Archer was thoroughly confused now. "Well," he said, "sounds like you've had quite the party. I can't wait to read your reports." "I think Malcolm should be the one to write it, Captain," Trip said, brightening suddenly, seeing as he had such a great time and all. Malcolm shot Trip a dirty look, and then quickly composed himself when he realized Archer was looking. "Happy to, sir," he said through gritted teeth before heading into the shuttle. The shuttle ride back, a brief visit to sickbay. Trip crashed in his quarters and slept and slept. He woke feeling refreshed and headed to the gym. As luck would have it, the only other person there was Malcolm, running on the treadmill. His face still bore the faint lines of the Sontaran tattoo ink. Trip nodded at him, not wanting to disturb his rhythm, and Malcolm acknowledged him with a brief nod. Trip went to the mat and started going through some stretches. Behind him, he heard the treadmill gradually slow to a walking pace, and he turned in time to see Malcolm stepping off, looking distinctly embarrassed. "It was their water, apparently," Malcolm blurted out. "It reacted with the headache medication Phlox gave me." "Water, huh?" Trip bent down to stretch. "I'm sure you'll add that to your list of things that are out to get us, right below evil space pollen." Malcolm made a noise of disgust. "Still, it turned out okay, didn't it?" he said, standing up straight again. Malcolm frowned. "I suppose so, all things considered. And—" He broke off, as if waging some internal war, and then he said stiffly, "While we're on that subject, thanks for watching out for me down there." He looked uncomfortable, as if expecting Trip to tease him. But Trip found that he didn't want to tease his friend. Not yet, anyway. He wanted Malcolm to lean on him, both figuratively and literally. He thought back to how he had shaken Malcolm awake after the shuttle had landed, how Malcolm had woken fully and realized where he was, the way he'd scrambled away from Trip, an extraordinary mixture of shame and dismay on his face. Malcolm had once confessed to him that he was starting to feel close to the crew of Enterprise. But he needed to learn that part of being a crew, a family, meant depending on others, trusting that they had your back, and that there was nothing shameful about that. So instead, Trip just said, "Anytime," and began bouncing on his feet, kicking at the air. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "What on earth are you doing?" "What you were doing," Trip said. "That martial arts dancing, remember?" "I remember it didn't look like that." Trip sprang back, blocking a punch from an invisible foe. "It was fun. Maybe we could add it to the weekly training sessions?" "It's called capoeira." "Capoeira, then." Trip gestured in front of him. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Malcolm stepped onto the mat, looking pleased despite himself. "You know, the first rule of capoeira is knowing when to duck." "Yeah, I worked that one out for myself." Trip assumed a fighting stance. "Ready?" Malcolm nodded, his eyes lighting up, and then he leapt. The end. You have been listening to Tripping the Light Fantastic, a story by Paper Crane Song. Thanks for listening.